Hello, good afternoon. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Wednesday, October 22nd, 2025. The time is 4:40 p.m., and I am in Miami, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is future heritage. And before I get into the main talking points, I would like to address a number of matters. The first matter I would like to address is a matter that I have attempted to drive home in various other lectures, but somehow the message just isn't registering. And this is particularly aimed at people who have known me personally or made my acquaintance over the past 25 years in particular, who may have Googled me out of curiosity recently, or in recent years rather, and seen my project and taken a hostile or adversarial posturing towards my project, or perhaps saw my project as something you could rip material off of, imitate copy, or somehow imply that you're involved in my project in any capacity. You all need to find something more constructive to do with your time. Okay? This is a solo project, and the reason it's a solo project is because I have to approach this matter called clandestine gang stalking with a very intimate and personal incline. Because assuming that I'm not the only targeted individual in this country and there are others, I imagine that all of our gang stalking campaigns are different from one another for different reasons. So anyone who listens to my discourses, anyone who listens to my lectures, anyone who reads my articles and posts, you're reading about gang stalking, organized stalking, community harassment, workplace mobbing, covert war, cause stalking, hate stalking, all of the above. From the experiences, ideas, opinions, and suggestions of E.I. Smith, me. You see, I can't speak for anybody else who's experiencing this. I hate if there's anyone else experiencing this, unless you're some violent, criminally prone maniac. Okay, if somebody fits that mold, then if they were to find themselves in a gang stalking campaign, I wouldn't care as much, quite frankly. But, as I always say, there are constitutional ways of handling problems and unconstitutional ways of handling problems. And quite frankly, regardless of who the person is and or the enemies that that person has made over the course of their life, and also regardless of any covert activity that the United States federal establishment has undertaken with respect to its ratification, financing, and implementation of clandestine gang stalking, you have to approach this matter from a constitutional perspective. Even if you're using covert mechanisms to contain terrorists or persons that you deem to be potential dangers to society with respect to their ability to do physical harm to people, you have to approach it from a structured way, from a structured manner, from a structured protocol, and according to government guidelines, constitutional guidelines, states' rights guidelines, human rights guidelines, inalienable rights guidelines. Okay, if there is some nutcase running around out there that you think is a threat to society, or somebody who might be plotting some sort of a mass attack or something like that, and the federal establishment or the federal or national security apparatus of this country gets word of it, and they feel a need to surveil that person closely, do what you have to do. Be professional about it, and don't bungle the operation. But ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, with these openers, okay, these introductions to the lecture where I address persons that I suspect are weighing down my project or are cumbersome influences, people who are not exactly fans of mine or fans of my work, hacking my tablet, hacking my computer, copying designs, or maybe taking my design ideas and trying to sell them to other people. Addressing these types is like sweeping the floor. From time to time, your apartment, your townhouse, your home, your mansion, your estate, okay, whatever you happen to live in, from time to time you gotta clean it. Vacuum the floors, mop the floors, sweep the floors. You may even hire a maid service or a janitorial service of some kind to come to your home and clean it. That's how I approach these matters. Okay? There are persons around Miami-Dade County and other counties I've lived in both Ohio and Tennessee, that have decided to attach themselves to my project in a deleterious way, which boggles the mind, because I am bringing to the masses the truth about a government-sponsored program that has the capacity to undermine the very fabric of democracy. And this is a problem that needs to be remedied. So I'm sweeping the floor. Okay, all that dust and those dust mites and all that dirt that you all are bringing, I'm sweeping the floor. All right, and I'm going to throw all that garbage in the trash can where it belongs. All right, and any other dirt you guys bring, it's going to get swept into a dustpan, and dumped in the trash. And the same goes for my significant other, Lori. If I find any of y'all pestering her, I'm coming right back to the people, to the public, to social media, and to the World Wide Web, and I'm going to let people know what you're up to. Okay? If you're not a truth seeker, but rather a disruptor, an agitator, an imposter, or an imitator, get lost. This project is not for you. And I'd also like to address people that watch my project and nitpick through it looking for attacks or threats against them personally. If you are nitpicking through my project looking for attacks or threats to you personally, then what you need to do is find a hobby or a pastime, anything to occupy your time away from my project. Okay? Spend more time with your wife and kids. Maybe go to your local pet store and buy a pet and get to know your pet and become good friends with it and spend time with your pet. Go to the park. Go outside. Walk around the block. Do what you got to do. Raise it. All right? Maybe you could get your kids enrolled in taekwondo or karate or jiu-jitsu classes and help your child become an Olympic karate fighter or something like that. Anything to pass your time. Maybe you're an adventurer type. Okay, rather than worry about what I write, because a lot of you don't really understand what I write. You're in the mix because you see something of significance is happening and you want to disrupt it. It's just your nature. Okay? Why not learn how to do something fun or adventurous? Maybe you could go to Antarctica and learn how to ice skate out there. Or maybe you could move to the North Pole, or maybe the South Pole, or Alaska. Okay, whatever your pocketbook allows you to do, and learn how to do ice fishing. You know, where you crack a hole on top of the ice on top of a river, lake, or body of water, and you throw a fishing pole in the opening and see if you can catch fish while waiting on top of the ice. Try that. Go and try a new hobby or pastime to where you don't have the time to nitpick my project for threats against you or someone you know, because you ain't doing nothing but trying to bring attention to yourself using my hard work as your anchor. Alright? I find you pathetic. Okay? If you want to make a name for yourself, go get good at something. Alright? If you're imitating me, or if you're an imposter, or you think you're going to somehow bring attention to yourself by obstructing what I do, I'm letting you know it's a futile effort. And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, I tend to do these discourses outside, so I may have to project or raise my voice from time to time to drown out the background noise. So adjust your volume accordingly. However, on the flip side of that, I would like to address the types of people that I want to look at my project. The truth seekers, the ones that appreciate research and history, politics and philosophy, humanities, the arts, discourse, the exchange of ideas, assertions and suggestions on good governance and the rule of law, civil freedoms and civil rights and constitutional matters. Those are the kinds of people that I want reading my material. Those are the kinds of people that I want tuning in to my project. Those are the kinds of people that I want to absorb my information, to enjoy what I do. That's the kind of audience I want. I want a dedicated, virtuous, open-minded audience that is courageous in their deeds and in their thinking. I tailor my discourses to such an audience. Now, I want to talk about future heritage. And the reason I want to talk about this matter is because heritage and similar ideas of a person's right to enjoy their stay in America gather an education, gather academic credentials, vote, take advantage of public resources, establish themselves in society, create wealth, okay, namely that you can pass down to your progeny if you have offspring, and assist them with their young lives, and leave them something when you have yourself passed on. Enjoying what makes America America, these civil freedoms that we hear about in the U.S. Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. The ability to absorb those freedoms, to take advantage of those freedoms, to allow those freedoms to work for you if you apply yourself. Okay, the ownership of property. All right, the ability to maintain oneself in a civil society. These are the fundamental rewards that a person reaps when they apply themselves to a occupational standard and to a standard of financial responsibility and to a standard of civility to one's fellow man. If a person applies these standards to their daily actions, there's no reason as to why this person cannot achieve the American dream of self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency means you can do for yourself without the help or interference of any third party. Now, what is heritage? And what is the general trajectory of American ideas of heritage? Well, let's start with the land that you live on. Okay? The land I live on is called the United States of America. How did I get here as opposed to how anybody else got here? Well, that question is easily answered through historical trajectories. We'll start with the Anglo-Saxon historical trajectory, and we'll bounce around a little bit to give you some idea of how various demographics got here to the United States and how that plays into their ideas of heritage. So Anglo-Saxons are descended from a combination of pilgrims and immigrants that came here in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Now the pilgrims came here originally from England, because they wanted to attempt to separate themselves from English financial policies. Now, it's not, you hear a lot about religion, the freedom to worship. Of course, that played into it, but the freedom to worship was not the central component of why the Pilgrims came to America. They didn't too much care for the Bank of England's monetary posturing towards the general populace as opposed to the very wealthy. That was their primary and their principal declaration for wanting to leave England. The religious element makes it more romantic. And yes, Protestantism at some point became a central component of American life because of the Pilgrims. But finance was at the root of their journey from Europe to here. Now, we're here. We have brave pilgrims that migrated to a new land that they considered uncharted waters, undiscovered territory, so that they could start a new civilization with ideals, okay, both social and political, all right, financial and otherwise, that they themselves set. That's fine. They came here on the Mayflower. When they got here, there were Indian tribes waiting on them. They looked around and said, all right, okay, there's people here already. They're not like us. They're not Europeans. They're different. But we can cohabitate with these people. We can teach them our ways, and they can teach us their ways, and we can build a society and a civilization that we both can live conducively in. So I'm going to abbreviate the next 300 years, okay? So over the next 300 years, the Pilgrims and the Indians got along great. Then the Indians said, no, they're multiplying too quickly in our land, and we feel like we're losing control of our land. So we're going to have to do something about this and start pushing these people out of here. The Pilgrims said, not so. We've been here for generations now, and we're prepared to protect our interests militarily. The Indians said, nah, you're consuming too much land. They're saying, we want land, we need land for our civilization and for our people. And the Indians are saying this is our land, and a war began in approximately 1624. And over the next 300 years, as this war was raging, the settlers began instituting various sophisticated political documents that were the foundation for the American federal establishment, as well as the various states in the Union and their individual rights as sovereign territorial entities, and various other laws and documents that outline the rights of United States citizens as sovereign citizens. And as this war with the Indians was raging, the Anglo-Saxon settlers were essentially expanding their political, social, religious, and economic interests simultaneously. At some point, the French came in and began settling. The Germans came in, or the Dutch rather, came in and began settling. And there were a number of wars that involved the settlers, the French, who took the side of the settlers, okay, the British, who took the side of the Indians, and the Indians themselves, all leading up to the Revolutionary War, which the settlers won. So, and that was 1776, if I'm not mistaken, when that war ended. And that was also the same year that the Declaration of Independence was signed. At this same time, there's the transatlantic slave trade happening. There are Africans that are being brought from Central and West Africa mostly to the United States to work in cotton fields, particularly in the American South, and contribute to the economy of the South through the cultivation of cotton and tobacco. So now, in the midst of all this political exuberance and these military conflicts, you have a new socio-political conundrum, and that is, why slavery? Is it ethical? Is it of God? Is it good for America? Is it good for American society? Is it good for the American economy? How does this institution benefit the United States? Okay, so you had a lot going on in this time period, and you had the remaining Indians or Native Americans embroiled in a feud for, at this point, it's pride. I don't think at this point the Native Americans had any hope of overtaking these settlers. Just simply put, the settlers were more enterprising than the Indians, and they were superior militarily. Okay, and especially when Andrew Jackson became president and Manifest Destiny was implemented, at this point it was all but over for the Indians, and they were nearly exterminated. But they were not. And the ones that remained were sort of, I guess, whisked away into plots of land that they were able to continue existing on. All right? This is a matter of historical record. So, from, let's say, the end of slavery, which was 1865, to the present day, this is more mainstream knowledge as to what the trajectory of American socio-political history is. The slaves were freed. Many traveled north. Some stayed in the South. The ones that traveled north had better opportunities than the ones that stayed in the South, mostly for cultural reasons. And in the South, you saw the trajectory of the Reconstruction era and the Ku Klux Klan and the lynching epidemic and various social justice reforms to allow blacks to live their lives out without fear of getting arbitrarily convicted of crimes they had nothing to do with and hanged from trees. And you also had the women's suffrage movement, which allowed women the right to vote. And you saw the Roaring '20s, you saw the Great Depression of the '30s, you saw the mafia and organized crime boom of the 1940s. And you saw the jukebox era of the 1950s, which came at the conclusion, for the most part, of the World War II, which is considered the war to end all wars, pretty much. Then we saw the Civil Rights era of the 1960s and 70s. Then we saw an economic boom in the 80s. particularly with technology, mass media and communications and entertainment. And then we saw the 90s hit with the onset of the information superhighway and how interconnectedness, data connections, and internet activity has pretty much permeated and changed the entire world. And from then on, we see various changes in how technology has changed the world, up even into the present day. Now, that is sort of a condensed version of American history from the founding, or rather from the arrival of the Pilgrims to the present day. It sounds good enough, right? You go from progression to progression to progression to progression, innovation to innovation to innovation to innovation. You have your various political movements. You have the evolution of government, the evolution of politics, the evolution of military, the evolution of law enforcement, the evolution of education, the evolution of social justice, the evolution of technology. You see all of these things. Now, that's sort of the mainstream, majority consumed, condensed version of American history. If you look at it from the perspective of a minority citizen, let's take an African American, your trajectory through history, you were present there, your ancestors were present there, your great-great-grandparents, your great-great-great-great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, and then your great-great-grandparents, your great-grandparents, and then your grandparents, okay, all saw this. Okay, they all witnessed this. From the founding of America to today, they all saw this. So, the trajectory of an African American would look something more like brought to the States from Africa. And mind you, there were African chiefs that sold slaves of their own villages to the slave traders. And then I think there was an Arab influence there as well that assisted in the gathering of slaves. And then there were Dutch and Portuguese influences as well there. It was a big business because Africans were considered uncivilized, particularly the ones that lived south of Egypt, Carthage, and Tunisia. Okay, the ones in West Central and East Africa were considered, and the ones in Sub-Saharan Africa were considered savages. Okay, based on how they lived, based on how they were, how they governed themselves. Okay, their civilizations and societies, they were considered only a step above the beasts of the field. Okay, there were some Dutch settlers that went into South Africa at some point and looked around and said, and this is a matter of historical record too, you know, these African people, they're, as far as I can tell, they're only probably just a little smarter than any monkey you see climbing up a tree. And that was the typical European in the 17th, or in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries in particular. That was the typical Europeans' idea of Africans. Okay, bones through the nose, cannibals, running around naked, no sense of government or society, no education at all, just very animalistic. Okay, that's typically how early medieval and later depictions of Africans were. And a lot of the governments in Europe at the time saw them as prime pickings. Well, we can get free labor from these. They can till the ground for us for free. They have no knowledge of money or finance or business. we could put them to work for free, give them a cot to live on, feed them 3 times a day, and let them breed. That's all they'd really need. But ultimately, you got into some abuses like whipping them with whips and beating them to a pulp and killing them and branding them with irons like cattle, and some were executed for fun. A lot of the women were raped. You started seeing a lot of really bad things happening to these Africans, and then that sort of shed a light on, well, what is slavery really, and how is this program ultimately going to affect American society? And Abraham Lincoln freed them because he wanted to hurt the American South's economy so that they couldn't prosecute a effective war against him. So his freeing of the slaves was mostly political in nature. He stated himself that he didn't really care whether or not we had slaves, that it wasn't really that big of a conundrum for him personally, but he wanted to free them so that the South wouldn't have anybody to cultivate tobacco and cotton, and it would weaken the economy because they wouldn't have anything to send to Western Europe, particularly I think Germany it was, for Deutschmarks to purchase the weapons and the ammo and the materials and the hospital necessities and so forth that it needs to prosecute a war. So the South ran out of money because of the freeing of the slaves, and Lincoln was able to take advantage of that militarily and win the war. So then you had Reconstruction, where blacks were, kind of, the American citizen, as an entity sort of aligned itself against them because, they had their own personal reasons as to why they needed to angle themselves against blacks in such a way. But then you had the Ku Klux Klan, then you had the civil rights movement, then you had various institutional situations that were considered, well, blacks are being systematically pushed out of the workforce institutionally, and there are various other practices like lending and college admissions and various other corporate matters that were of an institutional nature that people saw as racist against blacks. Then you started seeing a boom in black entertainers. For example, you saw the jazz boom, the R&B boom, the American movie boom, and the American athletics boom of the 1960s, which basically put blacks on the map as a race of good entertainers and athletes. And blacks used that as a source of pride throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and on into the 2000s when the first black president was elected. Do I think blacks are better off today because of the events of the past 60 years? Well, I'd say that black people are better off simply because they have the capacity to go into various industries that they've been proven successes in. And I believe that with the information technology boom that we've seen since then, black people have more access to data and information than they did 60 years ago, and can use that to further their educational goals, which can lead to better careers. Now, if you look at another racial group with respect to potential heritage, you could look at Latinos and Hispanics. So there weren't a lot of what you might refer to as Hispanics in the United States. We'll say the start of the era after the Declaration of Independence was signed. The highest concentration of Hispanics in the United States was in Texas, which, if I'm not mistaken, at that time was a part of Mexico. So there was a huge Mexican population in Texas. And Hispanic culture and its language was not at that time a huge part of American culture. It was a fringe part of American culture. And when General Zachary Taylor, who would go on to become the President of the United States at some point, orchestrated a military campaign to move the Mexicans out of Texas and push them down into Mexico so the United States could claim Texas for itself, he was able to do that successfully and was able to end the Mexican-American War with a victory for the United States. And I believe that caused some bitterness in the Mexican in the Mexican national consciousness. But ultimately, in these times, in the times that we're talking about now, with respect to when you have more than one country fighting over land, and they're actually fighting over it militarily, to the victor go the spoils. And that's always been the central and the most critical reality of war. The winner gets the trophy. Period. Okay? So, the trophy was Texas. The Americans won. And that was a huge acquisition. And we didn't really start seeing too many, as far as I can recall right now. Mind you, these discourses are extemporaneous, so we didn't see a huge Hispanic or Latino presence in the American societal mode of thinking until probably, I'd say maybe about 100 years later. And that was only because we started seeing in the 1970s, okay, which was about 130 years after the events of the Mexican-American War, you started seeing large groups of Mexicans coming across the border. And they were referred to as illegal aliens and undocumented persons. And there became a debate as to how to deal with this problem. And apparently it's a very complex debate because that was, 1972, I think, was the start of the discussion. That was 53 years ago. And America still hasn't figured out what to do about that. So it must be one hell of a conundrum for the United States if it's taken them 50 years to figure out what to do. And that's not me saying that Mexicans have a right to be here or Mexicans don't have a right to be here. I think Mexicans have a right to be anywhere they want to in the world. I think it's a better idea to be documented so that the general population doesn't attach the stigma of the illegal alien to you and to your people, which I think is what's happened here. I mean, if you ask most people if you ask most Americans, what comes to your mind when you think of Mexican citizens? They'll probably say things like illegal aliens, undocumented people, undocumented workers. They probably say stuff like, well, maid and janitor, and they sell tomatoes on the side of the road and sell flowers and water on the side of the road, or they live in a real dangerous country. They're corrupt as all hell. You can pay them to do almost anything, and I'm not sure how much they like the United States. And of because there's so many of them here illegally. There's no way to know how many of them are. And then they'll say things like, well, you got migrant caravans coming across the border and all kinds of high numbers. It's impossible to even come up with a number as to how many are here already. All right? That's realistically the kind of thing that I think the typical American thinks about Mexican people. And so if you look at the trajectory of Hispanics, and mind you, I know there are more than just Mexicans here. Okay, we have a sizable Cuban community here in Miami-Dade County. Okay, there's a fairly sizable Puerto Rican community here too, in parts of New York as well, and also in California and Arizona. There are a sizable combination of Puerto Rican and Mexican citizens there. So there's a fairly large Hispanic population here in the United States now. Okay, the United States has made it very difficult to ascertain how many are here legally and how many are not, but apparently the United States is poised to allow Spanish-speaking persons of Hispanic descent to become the majority here. At some point, the American federal establishment came to the realization, or rather the conclusion, that that's okay, and that's fine. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's something the American people need to know about, because that's a pretty huge cultural shift from Anglo-Saxon to Hispanic. So in 24 years, we will have a Hispanic majority here, and I think this topic that I cover, gang stalking, in many respects is supposed to somehow contribute to that handoff. And that's something I'm going to go into in more depth in the future. Okay? So there's a sense of heritage there as well. Now, if you look at, for example, Asian heritage here in the United States, do Asians have a sense of heritage here too? Yes. Okay, you have the Chinese steel workers of the 1920s. Okay, that worked in extremely harsh conditions on American railroads. Okay, you have the Chinese business presence here that I think probably began in the 1970s, where you had lots of convenience stores and grocery stores and food restaurants and clothing stores and hair salons and things like that that were owned by Chinese Americans. Okay, and I think over time you saw an increase in Chinese doctors and Chinese musicians and Chinese actors and actresses and Chinese computer programmers and things of that nature as time went on. But that was the start for the Chinese American. It was working on those railroads in California in, I think, the early 1900s. So Chinese people benefited the early American railroad system, and I think they have a sense of heritage, of belonging here because of that. So it's not just the groups I've named. I've selected a few. You know, for time's sake, I can't get into all of them. I typically keep these discourses within an hour or so. But you have the Italian migration here. You have the Irish, the late Irish migration here. You have Slavic, Eastern European migration. You have a sizable Filipino community here now. You have several communities, several racial communities here in the United States, all of which have a unique sense of heritage or a sense of belonging, indeed a sense of ownership of the country in which they live, the United States of America. Now, Me personally, I live in South Florida, which has a really interesting history. I mean, it was, it was settled by the Italians, if I'm not mistaken. The explorer, he doesn't come to mind, but the Italian explorers were the first here in the United States. So I'm assuming that the Italian explorers were the ones from the Kingdom of Italy, were the ones to first explore Florida. And then it sort of carried on as a U.S. territory. Then we saw an influx of Jewish settlers here that had a mind for finance and architecture and show business and real estate. And the Jewish community in the United States, particularly in the 1950s, made Miami an attraction. Okay, a luxury attraction and a tourist location. That was a very sought after tourist location. And then you saw a situation where the Cuban government began sending Cubans from their incarceration situation there to the United States. And there was quite a socio-political conundrum there, because quite frankly, it wasn't something that was talked about much outside of Miami. It was kind of something the federal government was embarrassed about. How is it that Fidel Castro can send prisoners, can free his prisoners, because he don't want them in Cuba? He can free his prisoners out of his jails and put them on boats and send them to America for us to deal with. Something like that would have gotten a lot of attention, but it was one of those things that the United States federal establishment didn't want to talk about too much because it was an embarrassment. It's not something that the heartland of America or the average American citizen knew about. It was kind of just seen as a Floridian's problem. And you saw multiplications untold. I mean, the population grew exponentially over the next few decades. And you saw Cuban migration, both legal and illegal, since then. And now Miami-Dade is mostly a Cuban inhabited area. I think 85% of the population now is Cuban. So the trajectory of the population of South Florida is a very dramatic and very politically dicey trajectory and story that I think any American would benefit in looking into. But that gives Cubans a separate identity from Mexicans as to their idea of heritage. Now, how does heritage play into clandestine gang stalking? And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, I may go over the 1 hour mark in this particular lecture because of the depth of the discussion. So, gang stalking is one of those things that was implemented for a number of reasons. It was meant to make average people feel above average and their ability to take signals, go out into the world and make stuff happen as a result of those signals. It was made to engineer society and change the trajectory of who could be successful in the United States and who can't. Because mind you, there are hiring managers and corporate officers in this country that will only hire people who know how to chuck signals at one another covertly. All right, there are some hiring managers who actually test interviewees during the hiring process to see if they know signaling. And if you demonstrate in the interview that you know signaling, you are going to be considered a better fit for that job than a person who does not know signaling. Okay, yes, there's gang stalking that happens in American companies. It's called workplace mobbing. It's how you control who works at a place and who doesn't. Maybe a corporate auxiliary teaches this signaling mechanism to let's say 1,000 employees, so that they can work together to keep a lid on who actually gets to enjoy their work experience. It turns into a situation where you have essentially a mechanism of disenfranchisement in the workplace. You have a covert signaling mechanism that people in the workplace use to assign certain jobs to certain employees and to treat certain employees differently than other employees. You can use workplace mobbing and its signaling mechanism to essentially create a community mobbing experience for a worker, where they get mobbed endlessly, sabotaged endlessly, pestered endlessly, and attacked endlessly by their own coworkers. And the coworkers participate in it because they don't want to be left out. They don't want to be the only one not chucking signals. And verbal commands. So, when you talk about heritage, the orchestrators of gang stalking have their own idea of heritage. They see heritage as the ability to work. Well, let's start earlier than that. The ability to have a pleasant childhood, the ability to be a productive teenager, the ability to earn an academic credential, the ability to work, the ability to marry, the ability to settle down, the ability to have children, the ability to work gainfully to where you can support this family, the ability to establish wealth, the ability to open and start businesses, the ability to run those businesses profitably, the ability to retire, okay? The ability to invest in financial products that will take care of you after you retire, okay? The ability to accumulate enough work credits to pull Social Security, the ability to retire comfortably, the ability to pass down wealth to your progeny, your offspring, your children, your generations, okay? That trajectory through life is considered the ideal trajectory in this country. Now, apparently, the national security apparatus of this country, its intelligence apparatus, and various other auxiliaries of the United States at the federal, state, and local level have gotten together under the banner of national security and said, well, let's make it so that this ideal path through life can only be attained by certain people. Another one might have chimed in, well, how do you do that? We have so many civil rights laws in this country, it would be impossible to do such a thing. I agree with you. I think only a few people should be able to live that type of lifestyle as well. After all, our heritage is the greater heritage. Our trajectory through America, through the ages, has been better than party A, B, and C. So I think our offspring should be able to live better lives than their offspring. Okay? Our heritage is greater than their heritage. So how do we do this? I mean, it was our people, it was our civilizations that founded this country and made it what it is today. Why shouldn't we have a better life than the people who don't look so much like we do? Their people came here as slaves. Their people got kicked out of Texas. Their people came over here as prisoners. Their people started off working on the railroads in our country. Okay? Their people came here on boats as prisoners, as property. Our people settled this land and paved the way. Okay, we tamed the wilderness. We got rid of the Indians, and we made this a Christian nation. Okay? Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's obvious that I'm talking about the Anglo-Saxon in that particular soliloquy, but let me tell you something, okay? There are white targeted individuals in this country, too. Okay, you remember back in the 90s when everything used to be, well, what is all this black on black crime about? How come there's all these black gang members shooting and killing each other and all these black people murdering each other? What's up with the black on black crime? There's white on white crime too. Look at clandestine gang stalking. What do you think white targeted individuals are experiencing? They're experiencing white on white crime. The orchestrators of gang stalking are overwhelmingly white. Okay, there are black gang stalkers, don't get me wrong. I've encountered a hell of a lot of black gang stalkers here in Florida. And when I look at my trajectory through life over the past 40 years, I've encountered a hell of them a lot in Ohio and Tennessee too. Okay, black people are not the orchestrators. Okay, gang stalking is not a black invention, but blacks participate in it. So do Asians, so do Hispanics. Most of my stalkers here in Miami-Dade County are Hispanic. All right, I'm sure there are Arabs and Indian people down here that do it too, but I don't encounter so many of them, so I'm not going to say anything with regard to that. But ultimately, there are particularly religious factions in the United States, and I oftentimes talk about the religious elements of gang stalking. I'm starting to suspect that the religious establishment in America has a bigger hand in its operation than previously thought. But there are religious administrators in this gang stalking thing that have this idea of this being a God-given country, and that God is behind this country, and that God empowered the settlers to wipe out the Indians, and that God empowered the transatlantic slave trade for 400 years because it was necessary to build the American South, and that God was the one that gave the Ku Klux Klan their power, and God was the one that dismantled the Black Panthers, and that God was the one that opened up the border so we could get 11 million undocumented people here because God wanted to show the world that Hispanics were his children too, and that God made that all possible, and how it was the work of Satan that blacks started becoming wealthy through entertainment, politics, and sports, and how it was God that unleashed hip-hop music on the black community so that the whole world could see that black people were empowered by Satan, and how the first black president was only biracial, not totally black. After all, according to our Christian doctrine, Barack Obama is half a child of Satan, his Nigerian half. So that must have been a satanic presidential election, but that's okay. They'll say to themselves, Satan wins sometimes, right? And there are Christians that really believe that too. That had to have been the work of Satan. Black people are descended from Cain, the evil brother that killed Abel right after the garden story. After Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, right, for acting like jerks, they conceived and had kids. One was Abel, one was Cain. Cain killed Abel out of jealousy. Black people are descended from Cain. That's what a lot of Christians think. So if Barack Obama is half the descendant of Cain, well, that means he's a half child of Satan. That don't give blacks no heritage here. You see? You'd be surprised. Okay? Now, I've always given credit where it's due from a historical perspective. Europeans have done well, particularly over the past 800 years, in politics, building governments, maintaining societies, architecture, and military prowess. Okay? That's saying a lot. Okay? I think that Asians, okay, particularly North Asians, because I've studied North Asian history a little more in depth than I have South Asian history, okay? North Asians have done phenomenally well in these areas as well. And in recent years, they've done, particularly China, North Korea, Japan, okay, and other North Asian countries, they've done amazingly well with creating innovative financial products. I mean, look at China, for example. China manages an economy of 2.1 billion people successfully. It's a very thriving economy. Okay? Blacks have done well, in my opinion, in oratory and in politics and in judicial matters and in events that require physical intelligence like sports and dance, and also in the arts, particularly music. All right. East Indians appear to have done very well in medicine and in entrepreneurship. All right, as have the Aryan people, like for example the Iranians. All right. Something positive can be said about every race, every demographic in the United States, and also there's negative things that could be said about every race. Some of the races that have settled here in the United States are totally xenophobic. I mean, there are people here in the United States that simply have their own idea of what races should even be allowed to push forward. Okay? There are also people in this country that believe that certain rights and freedoms and lifestyles should be set aside for this demographic, but not that demographic, based on a number of philosophical, political, religious, and personal reasons. As I've said in previous discourses, there are religious principles that appear to okay xenophobia and the extermination of people. All a person can really do at this point is use their common sense and hope that the federal establishment of the country they live in has people elected into its seats who have a sense of decency, good governance, rule of law, what makes a good society, what makes a good civilization. Look at gang stalking, for example. It ducks all that, right? Everything I've talked about over the past hour, gang stalking just kind of climbs underneath it and crawls around it, right? Gang stalking, this program, which is essentially a social engineering, human experimentation, human behavior modification, disease spreading attack mechanism, is really just sort of like it's its own animal. It's like a self-conceived animal. Okay, it was conceived obviously by the Departments of Defense and Justice to combat terrorism, but then it was like, well, we can use this to do other things. We can actually change society and steer it in any way we choose to using this mechanism. All we have to do is ensure that the people that we like occupy the jobs and the various other enterprises that shape society, and people that we don't like can be systematically kept out of these jobs, occupations, and careers that shape society. Because there are occupations, there are callings, there are skills and trades that shape society. And what we want to do as stalkers, as the orchestrators, is we want to make sure that only certain people have access to the kinds of jobs, the kinds of careers, and the kinds of educations that could make them society changers. Okay? Regardless of what your background is, regardless of what your demographic is, regardless of what you believe your heritage to be, regardless of what your heritage actually is, ultimately, this is a country that was founded upon principles, and even to the present day, even though we're more diverse now, this is still a country that runs on the same principles that those pilgrims had. All those generations ago. And we intend on honoring the legacy of those pilgrims. Okay? And who they were and what they stood for and what they believed theologically. We're going to uphold everything they stood for, and we're going to make sure that their descendants and their racial cousins have first dibs on the American dream. And we don't care if anyone says it's unfair. That Smith fella can talk till the cows come home. We could keep him in a gang stalking campaign for the next 40 years. And it wouldn't make a dent in anything we do. We're going to make sure that people whose ancestors had more to do with the success of this country have a better chance of living the American dream. We can devise a system, a network, a communication, a code that is protected and implemented by the state. That makes parties A, B, and C feel like they're a part of something, keeping parties D, E, and F out of society as contributing members, and creating the kind of country that we think is right. Because after all, this country is an Anglo-Saxon construct and a Christian one. So why shouldn't that particular demographic have better opportunities? And no, this ain't a meritocracy. This ain't a race. This isn't a foot race like those black people like. They like foot races. They like running real fast. That's why they're good at track and field. That's why they're good at football. That's why they're good at basketball. Right? They like to run real fast. They like foot races. Okay? They're physically capable of that. Probably more so than anybody in the world. But that's why this society ain't no foot race. This society ain't no basketball game. This society ain't no football game. This society ain't no boxing match. All right? It's none of the things that blacks have been good at. That's not what this society is. They're entertainers. The ones that actually run society, the ones that make it tick, the ones that build the roads, the ones that build the houses, the ones that create the pipelines, the ones that build your electrical systems, the ones that design fiber optic networks, okay, the ones that plan out communities, the ones that plan out cities, the ones that are investing in skyscrapers, the ones that are starting these financial corporations that become giants, the ones that run your media, the ones that run your banks, the ones that run your automotive industry, the ones that run your various other mass communication sectors, they're the ones that are ultimately going to get to decide your trajectory through life. Okay? It don't matter. I don't care what school you go to. I don't care what kind of grades you make. I don't care how good a person you are. I don't care how responsible you are. Your trajectory through life, regardless of whoever you are and wherever you come from is going to be decided by a faction. Now, the average American is not a part of that faction. The average American actually thinks this is a meritocracy. The average American believes that he who works hardest gains the most. He who is the most educated gains the most. He who is the most committed gains the most. He who has the best work ethic gains the most. He who has the most discipline gains the most. That is not how America runs, and it's never run like that. Okay? The people that succeed in this country are the ones who are plugged into the right connections and the ones who are able to manipulate scenarios well. Who's to say that's good? Who's to say that's bad? I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying that's the way it is. Being able to manipulate schemes and things like that, that's a skill in itself, honestly. It may not be one that Jesus would have liked, but it's still a skill. And there are a lot of people who know how to manipulate scenarios and circumstances and people's lives that turn out really well in life. Okay? America's not a meritocracy. Okay? I don't care how good you are at something. There was always a third-party force that can stop you from succeeding for any number of reasons. Who wants to stop Emmanuel Isaiah Smith from succeeding? I don't know. They aren't man enough to show their face to me. But there is a third party out there that has found a way to include me in a state-led system of constant disruptions and attacks. Okay? This state-led system called clandestine gang stalking has apparently inflicted the lives of a lot of people. Why does it exist? It's experimental. It's a data collection module. It's a human behavior experimentation. It is a way to understand the human mind better. It's a way to push the limits of government better. Okay? It's a way of discovering more about the human spirit or the human will. It's a way of figuring out what it takes to get people to work together and how people come together around common causes. It's a way of testing military-industrial stratagem and weapons. It's a way of raising revenues for the military-industrial complex. There's so much that goes into this. Heritage is a central component of it because you will find that people who come forward as targeted individuals are probably typically the kinds of people who have been determined by this entity or that entity to not have much of a heritage here, to not have much of a claim to the success of the United States. So if you don't have a claim to the success of the United States, even if that claim is ancestral or cultural, then who are you to complain about anything that happens in the United States? Okay? What is affirmative action? Why do blacks need that? What have they done to further society? What is reparations? Why does the taxpayer need to pay black people for something that happened 200 years ago? Okay? Why do we need quotas? Why do black people need to be shoo-ins for jobs and university considerations if they're not going to contribute to the learning culture like other kids will? Why should we make home loans and car loans easier to get for black people? They default on more loans than other people do. The same for Hispanics. Why do we need to make special accommodations for them? What is their history here? What is their legacy here? Illegal immigration? Salsa music? Okay? Who's propping up them? Is it the Catholic Church? Is it the Mormon Church? Is it the Democratic Party? Who is propping up Hispanics, and why are they able to operate with impunity in this country? That's what somebody in the gang stalking community might assert. Gang stalkers have very caricaturish images of people that are not like them. Even the ones that are non-white or non-Caucasian, the black ones do too. I've seen black gang stalkers talk worse about other black people than I've ever heard white or Hispanics do. The same, I've heard Hispanics talk horribly about other Hispanics. I've heard white gang stalkers talk horribly about the white race. They are a very ass-backwards bunch, these gang stalkers, okay? Ultimately, heritage plays a huge role in clandestine gang stalking. What you might find eventually is the Departments of Defense and the Departments of Justice coming forward and saying, we've discovered this or that, but we're not going to make too big a deal about it. We want to keep this country in good graces with the rest of the world and in good graces with the people. So we're not going to too much throw into this narrative of there being hidden or covert or secret gang stalking cabals here in the United States or anything of that nature. Because ultimately, this program helps certain people get ahead. And we get to use this program to pick and choose who succeeds in America and who gets devastated by this covert war mechanism. And that's how we like it, and apparently Congress ain't going to say nothing about it. Neither is the media. Neither is your pastor. Why? Because there are people in all three of these auxiliaries that use this program to get ahead and stay ahead. And we can orchestrate catastrophes in the lives of anyone that we see as competitors to our constant manipulations and our frivolous claim to a bigger piece of the American pie than other people. Ladies and gentlemen, the only remedy to that kind of thinking is the United States Constitution. By law, it applies to everyone. By law, the Bill of Rights applies to everyone. By law, the Declaration, its precepts, applies to everyone. And that goes for all the state constitutions as well. They apply to all the residents there. And it makes no consideration or no exception for any demographic group. Simply put, if you are a resident, a citizen of this country, the U.S. Constitution, it applies to you. So if you're experiencing something that has essentially either ignored or breached your constitutional rights, you have a right to invoke your First Amendment to the Constitution, as I do on a daily basis, and talk about what needs to be done. Repeal gang stalking, okay, defund it, apologize to the American people for implementing it, and if you want a bigger presence of people in this country that are going to watch things, which is what some gang stalkers apparently disguise themselves as. Well, we're watching things. We're keeping an eye on things. We're making our communities safer by identifying potentially suspect people and using a signaling and alert system to descend upon them with violence, semi-violence, and pestering until they leave. Okay, companies use that against employees that they don't want. I wouldn't be surprised at all if schools and universities have such a mechanism that's used on students that aren't welcome. I'm sure that there are churches that have a similar method of signaling that is used to descend on congregants that aren't welcome. And you have countries, entire countries like the United States, that use federal resources and taxpayer money to fund a liaison program that allows for the mobilization of scores of useful, idiot, hostile-minded, surly, gang-stalking knuckleheads that get to descend upon any citizen that they're signaled to just about without recourse. The only thing a citizen could do is either remove themselves from the debacle or call the police. And a lot of these stalkers like to ride off into the sunset like the Lone Ranger when the police are called. That should tell you right there what their program is made out of. Thank you for tuning in.